truck stop at night is a city that never sleeps. It's a brightly lit oasis in the vast darkness of the American landscape, a beacon for the weary road warrior. It's a place of comforting rituals, the hiss of air brakes, the smell of diesel and cheap coffee, the low murmur of conversations over the CB radio. For a trucker, it's a place to refuel, to eat a hot meal, and to feel, for a brief time, a sense of community and safety. But truck stops are also crossroads of anonymity. They are transient spaces where thousands of strangers from every walk of life converge and then disperse. In the deep hours of the night, when the diner crowd thins and the parking lot settles into a low, humming quiet, a different element can emerge. The shadows at the edge of the bright lights can hold secrets, and the faces of the other late-night travelers can mask dark intentions. Today, we're pulling into the back row of the parking lot to share 3 true, terrifying accounts from truckers who discovered that the sanctuary of the truck stop is a fragile illusion. These are stories of encounters that happened just steps from their cab, proving that the greatest dangers aren't always on the road, but in the places they stop to rest. Story 1. The Man Who Watched the Pumps. Our first story comes from a driver named Leo, a man who spent the better part of his career hauling livestock. It was a tough, smelly, and demanding job, but Leo was good at it. In the summer of 2004, he was on a run through the Texas Panhandle, a flat, desolate landscape where the sky is immense and the towns are few and far between. The heat was oppressive, even late at night, and the air was thick and still. It was on this lonely stretch of road that he pulled into a small, independent truck stop for a routine fuel-up, an act he'd performed 1,000 times, but this time it led to an encounter that would haunt him for years. The truck stop was a tiny, run-down place, little more than a set of fuel pumps, a small convenience store, and a dusty gravel lot. It was the only stop for 50 miles in any direction. It was around 1 a.m. and the place was nearly deserted. There was only one other truck in the lot and a single, beat-up sedan parked near the store. Leo pulled his big cattle truck up to the diesel pumps. The fluorescent lights of the fuel island canopy cast a harsh, buzzing, greenish glow, attracting a frantic swarm of moths. As he stepped out of his cab into the soupy hot air, he noticed a man. The man was sitting on the curb just at the edge of the light, about 20 feet from the pumps. He was just sitting there, his knees drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around them. He was rail-thin and dressed in dirty, ragged clothes. But what struck Leo as deeply strange was his posture. He was completely motionless, his head cocked at a slight, unnatural angle, and he was staring intently at the fuel pumps. He wasn't looking at Leo or his truck. His gaze was fixed on the pumps themselves, as if he were watching a fascinating television show. Leo, a man who believed in minding his own business, tried to ignore him. He figured the man was a transient, maybe down on his luck, waiting for a handout. He swiped his company fuel card and began the slow process of filling the massive tanks on his rig. The diesel pump roared to life, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. As the fuel flowed, Leo couldn't help but glance over at the man on the curb. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was still locked in that same strange, rigid posture, his eyes fixed on the pumps. The intensity of his stare was unnerving. It wasn't a casual gaze. It was a look of profound, obsessive concentration. The harsh green light of the canopy cast strange shadows on his face, making it look gaunt and skull-like. After a few minutes, Leo finished filling the first tank and moved the nozzle to the second. The whole time, the man remained as still as a statue. The sheer, unwavering stillness was what started to get to Leo. It was unnatural. A normal person would shift their weight, scratch an itch, look around. This man was like a wax figure. Leo finished fueling and hung up the nozzle. He needed to go inside to get his receipt. This meant he would have to walk past the man. A knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. He told himself he was being ridiculous. The man hadn't done anything threatening. He was just sitting there. Taking a deep breath, Leo started walking towards the convenience store. As he approached the man, he kept his eyes forward, determined not to engage. But as he drew level with him, the man spoke. His voice was a dry, rasping whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "It's thirsty," he said. Leo froze, his hand on the door to the store. He slowly turned to look at the man. The man's head hadn't moved. He was still staring at the pumps, but his lips had peeled back from his teeth in a semblance of a smile. It was a ghastly, lipless grin. "Excuse me," Leo said, his voice coming out a little shakier than he intended. "The ground," the man whispered, his terrible smile widening. "It's always so thirsty." A jolt of pure, irrational fear shot through Leo. The man's words made no sense, but they were delivered with a chilling, secret knowledge, as if he were sharing a profound and terrible truth. Leo didn't reply. He ripped the store door open and practically fell inside. The store was empty except for a young, bored-looking clerk behind the counter. The air conditioning was a welcome relief. Leo's heart was pounding. He tried to compose himself as he walked to the counter. "Everything all right out there, man?" the clerk asked, noticing Leo's shaken state. "Yeah, fine," Leo lied. "Just, who's the guy sitting out by the pumps?" The clerk glanced out the window and then shrugged. "Don't know. He just showed up about an hour ago. Hasn't moved, hasn't said a word. Just sits there, watching the pumps. Creepy as hell, if you ask me." Leo got his receipt and a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. He needed to get back to his truck, but the thought of walking past that man again filled him with a deep, primal dread. He lingered in the store for a few minutes, pretending to look at the snacks, hoping the man would leave. He didn't. Finally, knowing he couldn't wait forever, Leo took a deep breath and walked out the door. The man was still on the curb, in the exact same position. As Leo walked past, the man spoke again, his voice the same dry, dead whisper. "You have a leak," he said. Leo stopped and turned. "What are you talking about? I don't have a leak." The man slowly, for the first time, turned his head to look at Leo. His eyes were dark, sunken pits in his gaunt face, and they glittered with a strange, manic light. "Not you," he whispered, his lipless grin returning. "The truck, it's leaking. It's feeding the ground." Leo stared at him, bewildered and terrified. He quickly looked under his rig. The asphalt was dry. There was no leak. "You're crazy, man," he muttered, and turned to walk away. He had taken 2 steps when he heard a soft, wet, tearing sound behind him. He spun around. The man was no longer on the curb. He was now standing, and he was holding something in his hands. It was a long, thin, sharpened piece of rebar, like a giant needle, and he was smiling that same terrible, wide grin. "The ground needs to drink," the man rasped, and he started walking towards Leo, holding the rebar like a spear. Leo didn't think. He ran. He scrambled for the door of his cab, his fingers fumbling with the handle. He could hear the man's shuffling footsteps on the asphalt behind him. Getting closer, he ripped the door open and threw himself inside, slamming and locking it just as the man reached the truck. Clang! A loud, metallic impact rang out as the man slammed the rebar against the side of the cab. Leo screamed, scrambling away from the door, his back pressed against the passenger seat. Clang, clang, clang. The man was stabbing the rebar repeatedly against the truck's fuel tank, the sharp point striking sparks in the darkness. He was trying to puncture the tank. He was trying to feed the ground. Leo fumbled for his air horn cord and gave it a series of frantic, desperate blasts. The deafening sound echoed across the empty landscape. He saw the clerk's head pop up inside the store, his eyes wide with alarm. The man outside was undeterred. He continued his frenzied assault on the fuel tank, his movements becoming more frantic, his whispers turning into guttural, angry snarls. Leo watched in horror, trapped in his cab, listening to the relentless, metallic ringing. He saw the clerk on the phone, presumably calling the police. The man with the rebar seemed to notice this too. He stopped his attack on the fuel tank and turned his attention to the cab. He walked to the front of the truck, and Leo could see his gaunt, shadowy form in the glow of the canopy lights. He raised the rebar high above his head and brought it down with all his might on the windshield. The glass crazed with a spider web of cracks, but it held. The man raised the rebar again, but before he could strike, the sound of an approaching siren cut through the night. The man froze. He looked in the direction of the siren, then back at Leo, who was cowering inside the cab. He gave one last, terrible, lipless grin, a look of pure, malevolent disappointment. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for his emaciated frame, he turned and sprinted away from the light of the fuel island, disappearing into the absolute darkness that surrounded the truck stop. The police arrived minutes later. They took Leo's statement and searched the area, but the man was gone. He had vanished as if he were a phantom. The only evidence of his existence was the damaged windshield and the deep, sharp gouges in the side of Leo's fuel tank. Leo never found out who the man was or what his insane obsession with feeding the ground was all about. The police treated it as an attack by a disturbed transient, but for Leo, it felt like something more. It felt like he had encountered a creature that was not entirely human, a ghoul that haunted that lonely patch of asphalt, driven by a dark and thirsty madness. He never stopped at a small, independent truck stop at night again. The memory of that gaunt, smiling face and the dry, whispering voice was a permanent reminder that some things are waiting in the darkness, at the edge of the light, and they are always, always thirsty. Story 2. The Man in the Red Dually. The back row of a truck stop parking lot is a world of unspoken rules. It's the quiet zone, the place for drivers who are shutting down for their full 10-hour break. It's a place of mutual, anonymous respect. You keep to yourself, you don't make noise, and you let other drivers sleep. Our second story is about what happens when someone breaks those rules in the most terrifying way possible. It comes from a driver named Dave, who, in 2011, had a chilling, slow-burn encounter with a fellow driver at a large chain truck stop in western Nebraska. Dave was on a cross-country run, hauling a load of furniture from California to New York. He was exhausted after a long day battling high winds and heavy traffic. He pulled into a sprawling, brightly lit pilot truck stop around midnight, looking for a quiet spot to get his mandatory rest. The lot was packed, but he found an open space in the far back row, the last spot in a long line of dark, silent rigs. He backed his truck in, did his post-trip inspection, and settled into his sleeper for the night. He was just drifting off to sleep when a new truck pulled into the spot next to him. Dave was slightly annoyed. The roar of the engine and the hiss of the air brakes had jolted him awake. But it was part of life on the road. He rolled over, trying to get back to sleep. But the new truck didn't shut down. It just sat there, its diesel engine idling with a deep, throbbing rumble that vibrated through Dave's own cab. This was a major breach of truck stop etiquette. You don't idle in the back row unless it's brutally hot or cold, and tonight the weather was mild. Dave lay there, growing more and more irritated, listening to the relentless drone of the engine next door. After about 30 minutes, he'd had enough. He got up, pulled on his boots, and stepped out of his cab, ready to have a firm but polite word with the other driver. The truck next to him was a customized, cherry-red Dodge Ram 3500, a dually pickup hauling a long, enclosed gooseneck trailer. It was a hotshot rig, not a semi, which was unusual for this part of the lot. The windows were heavily tinted, and he couldn't see inside. He walked up to the driver's side door and knocked on the window. "Hey, driver," he called out. "You mind shutting it down? Trying to sleep back here." There was no response. The engine continued to idle. Dave knocked again, harder this time. "Hey, Can you hear me? Kill the engine." Still nothing. Annoyed and a little confused, Dave peered closer, trying to see through the tinted glass. He could just make out the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat, sitting perfectly still, facing forward. The person was completely ignoring him. Frustrated, Dave gave up and went back to his own truck, muttering under his breath. He tried to block out the noise with a pillow over his head, but the low-frequency vibration was inescapable. Sleep was impossible. He lay there for another hour, his anger simmering, listening to the constant, disrespectful rumble. Around 2 a.m., the idling engine next door was joined by a new sound. Music. It was a strange, old-timey country song, played on a tinny-sounding radio, and it was loud. So loud that Dave could hear the lyrics clearly through his own closed windows. The driver had not only left his engine running, but he had now decided to blast his radio in the middle of the quiet zone. This was more than just rude. It was aggressive. It felt like a deliberate provocation. Dave was furious. He got out of his truck again, his fists clenched, ready for a confrontation. He stormed over to the red dually and pounded on the window with the heel of his hand. "Turn that damn music off," he yelled. "This is the back row. Have some respect." The music continued unabated. The silhouette inside hadn't moved. It was as if the driver was in a trance or dead to the world. But the truck was running. The radio was on. Someone had to be in there, and they had to be awake. Just as Dave was about to start shouting again, the music stopped. The engine cut out. The sudden silence was so profound it was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Dave stood there, confused. Had the driver finally heard him? He waited. A minute passed. The door of the red dually creaked open. A man stepped out. He was a large man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a greasy baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. He moved with a strange, slow deliberation. He didn't look at Dave. He just stood by his truck for a moment, then began to walk slowly toward the back of his long, enclosed trailer. Dave, still angry but also deeply unsettled by the man's strange behavior, watched him go. The man fumbled with the locks on the rear doors of his trailer, the metallic clicks echoing in the quiet lot. He swung the heavy doors open. From where he was standing, Dave couldn't see inside the trailer. The man stood there for a long moment, his back to Dave, staring into the darkness of his cargo bay. Then he reached in and pulled something out. It was a woman. She was limp, unconscious, or dead, her arms and legs dangling like a rag doll's. The man slung her over his shoulder with an unnerving ease, as if she weighed nothing. He closed the trailer doors, his movement still slow and deliberate, and then began to walk, carrying the woman away from the trucks and toward the dark, open field that bordered the truck stop. Dave was frozen in place, his mind struggling to process the horrifying scene he had just witnessed. This wasn't a domestic dispute. This wasn't a prank. He had just seen a man pull an unconscious woman out of a trailer like a piece of cargo. His trucker instincts, his sense of self-preservation, screamed at him to get back in his cab, lock the doors, and drive away, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. But another part of him, the decent, human part, knew he couldn't. He had to do something. He scrambled back into his own cab, his hands shaking. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed 911, his voice a choked whisper as he told the dispatcher what he had just seen. He gave them the location, a description of the red dually, the trailer, and the man. While he was on the phone, he watched from his window as the man reached the edge of the field and disappeared with his victim into the tall, dark grass. The police arrived with startling speed, their cruisers swarming the truck stop without sirens, their movements tactical and quiet. Dave directed them to the red dually and told them which way the man had gone. The officers, armed with rifles and flashlights, fanned out and began a search of the dark field. Dave sat in his cab, his heart pounding, watching the beams of the officers' flashlights cutting through the darkness. It felt like an eternity. After about 20 minutes, he saw the flashlight beams converge on a single spot deep in the field. There was a brief commotion, some muffled shouts, and then two of the officers began walking back towards the lot, supporting a stumbling, disoriented figure between them. It was the woman. She was alive. A few minutes later, the other officers emerged from the field, their guns drawn, surrounding the large man. He wasn't struggling. He was walking with the same slow, deliberate calm, his face an emotionless mask. The story came out later. The man was a long-haul hotshot driver who was also a suspect in a string of disappearances of women along the I-80 corridor. His method was to abduct women, hold them captive in a hidden, soundproofed compartment in his trailer, and transport them across state lines. The woman Dave had saved was his latest victim, a college student he had abducted from a rest stop in Wyoming 2 days earlier. The police told Dave that the man's strange behavior, the idling engine, the loud music, was a deliberate tactic. It was a form of psychological warfare, a way to intimidate other drivers and discourage them from parking nearby or paying too much attention to his rig. He was creating a bubble of aggressive annoyance around himself to hide his horrific crimes. He would have likely killed the woman in that field and left her there, just as he had probably done with others. Dave was hailed as a hero, but he never felt like one. He felt sick. He had been just a few feet away from a woman being held captive, and his only reaction had been annoyance at the noise. The experience shattered his sense of the truck stop as a safe community. It was a stark, terrifying reminder that the driver parked next to you, the anonymous silhouette in the next cab, could be anyone, and that the unspoken rules of the road could be used as a cover for the most unspeakable evil. He never again parked in the back row of a truck stop without a profound sense of dread, forever haunted by the memory of the man in the red Dually and the terrible secret he had been hauling in the dark. Story 3. The souvenir collector, the vast, sprawling truck stops that dot the American interstate, are more than just places to refuel. They are small, self-contained economies. They have diners, repair shops, motels, and massive convenience stores that sell everything a driver could possibly need, from engine parts to electronics to cheap, kitschy souvenirs. Our final story is about one of these souvenirs and the terrifying obsession of the man who collected them. It comes from a driver named Paul who, in 2016, had a chilling encounter at a Flying J truck stop off I-40 in Arkansas. Paul was a creature of habit. He had been driving for over 20 years, and he had his routine down to a science. He always tried to stop at the same chain truck stops. He always parked in a well-lit area, and he always ended his night with a walk through the store, picking up a coffee and a newspaper for the morning. It was a way to stretch his legs and decompress before settling into his sleeper. On this particular night, it was late, around midnight. The store was mostly empty, save for a few other weary-looking drivers and the lone cashier. As Paul was browsing the aisles, he noticed another man who seemed to be doing the same. The man was nondescript, middle-aged, with thinning hair and a paunch that strained against his faded polo shirt. He looked like 1,000 other tired, lonely men you see on the road. But there was something odd about his behavior. He wasn't looking at the snacks or the drinks or the truck supplies. He was focused entirely on the souvenir section, a rotating rack filled with cheap, brightly colored trinkets. Keychains, snow globes, shot glasses, and miniature license plates, all emblazoned with Arkansas, the natural state. The man was meticulously, almost obsessively, examining the miniature license plates. He would pick one up, hold it close to his face, scrutinize it for a long moment, and then place it back on the rack with a look of faint disappointment. He did this over and over, his movements precise and repetitive. Paul, mildly curious, watched him for a moment before getting his coffee and heading to the checkout counter. The man was in line in front of him. He hadn't bought anything. As the cashier rang up Paul's coffee, the man suddenly turned to him. "You're not from around here, are you?" the man asked. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes had a strange, unfocused intensity. "Nope, sir, just passing through," Paul replied, taken aback by the sudden question. The man nodded slowly. "Passing through?" he repeated, as if the words had a profound meaning. "Everyone's just passing through." He then turned and walked out of the store without another word. Paul was a little unsettled by the strange philosophical encounter, but he quickly forgot about it. He went back to his truck, locked the doors, and settled into his sleeper cab with his coffee and newspaper. He was reading an article when he heard a soft knock on his passenger side door. His senses immediately went on high alert. A knock on the door this late at night was never a good sign. He quietly moved to the front of the cab and peeked through the window. It was the man from the store. He was standing just outside the door, his hands in his pockets, a strange, placid smile on his face. Paul did not open the door. He cracked the window just enough to speak. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice firm. "I was just wondering where you're headed," the man said, his voice still soft and gentle. "Your license plate. It's a California plate. That's a long way from here." A chill went down Paul's spine. The man had noticed his license plate. He had been paying attention. "I'm headed east," Paul said vaguely. "Now, if you don't mind, I'm trying to get some sleep." The man's smile didn't falter. Of course, he said. "I collect them, you know." "Collect what?" Paul asked, his hand hovering over the door lock, making sure it was engaged. "The plates," the man said, his eyes glittering with that same strange intensity. "The little ones in the store are nice, but they're not the same. I like the real ones, the ones that have been places, the ones with stories." He took a step closer to the truck. "A California plate. I don't have a California yet. It would be a fine addition to my collection." The man's gentle tone had not changed, but his words were filled with a terrifying, possessive implication. He wasn't talking about collecting souvenirs. He was talking about collecting the actual license plates from trucks, from people. "You need to leave," Paul said, his voice low and dangerous. "Right now." The man's smile finally faded, replaced by a look of childish disappointment. "But I need it," he whispered, more to himself than to Paul. "The collection isn't complete." He stood there for a long, tense moment, staring at the front of Paul's truck, his gaze fixed on the license plate. Then he sighed, turned, and walked away, disappearing between the rows of parked trucks. Paul sat in his cab for a long time, his heart pounding. The encounter had been brief, but it had been one of the most unsettling experiences of his life. The man's calm, gentle demeanor, combined with his creepy obsession, was a deeply disturbing cocktail. He made sure his doors were locked, his windows were up, and he eventually fell into a troubled sleep. He was awakened a few hours later by a scraping sound. It was a metallic, rhythmic scraping, and it was coming from the front of his truck. He sat up, his blood running cold. He knew with a sickening certainty who it was. He crept to the front of his cab and peered through the windshield. It was him, the man from the store. He was crouched in front of Paul's rig, in the narrow, dark space between Paul's bumper and the trailer of the truck parked in front of him. He had a screwdriver in his hand, and he was methodically, patiently, trying to pry the license plate off Paul's front bumper. Paul was filled with a mixture of rage and terror. This man was so obsessed, so brazen, that he was attempting to steal a piece of his truck while he was sleeping inside it. Paul didn't think. He reacted. He laid on the air horn, a deafening, continuous blast that ripped through the quiet parking lot. The man in front of the truck jumped, startled, and dropped his screwdriver. He looked up, his eyes wide, and for a moment he locked eyes with Paul through the windshield. The placid, gentle expression was gone. In its place was a look of pure, animalistic rage. a look of fury at being interrupted, at being denied his prize. The man scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing once again into the labyrinth of parked trucks. Paul immediately called truck stop security and then the police. He described the man and what had happened. A security guard came by, and they found the screwdriver the man had dropped. The police took a report, but they were dismissive, treating it as a minor, attempted theft by a local eccentric. But Paul knew it was more than that. The man's obsession, the look in his eyes, the calm way he spoke of his collection, it all pointed to something far darker. This wasn't just about a piece of metal. It was about possessing a piece of the person, the traveler. It was about capturing the story. The police never found the man. But as they were taking the report, the security guard told Paul something that made the incident even more chilling. "We've had weird reports about that guy for months," the guard said. "He lives in the motel attached to the truck stop. Never seems to work. Just hangs around the store and the lot. A few other drivers have complained about him, said he was asking strange questions about their plates. But this is the first time he's actually tried to take one." The guard paused, then lowered his voice. "The weirdest thing, though, about a month ago, a driver vanished from this very truck stop. An owner-operator from Arizona. He was here one night, gone the next, left his whole rig behind, fully loaded, just disappeared. The police found his truck, but the license plates, they were missing." Paul stared at the guard, the blood draining from his face. His encounter had not been a random, creepy incident. He had been targeted by a man who was not just a collector, but potentially a killer. A man who didn't just take the license plates, but perhaps took the drivers too, making their trucks the final, anonymous monuments to their disappearance. Paul got his dispatcher to give him a new route, one that would never take him through Arkansas again. He had stumbled upon a predator who hunted in the one place truckers were supposed to be safe. He had come face to face with a man whose souvenir collection was likely written in the names of the missing. A chilling reminder that in the transient world of the truck stop, some collectors will stop at nothing to get their hands on a rare and final edition.